My husband texted me from Cancun. I ran away with your best friend. We are never coming back. I replied, good luck. I canceled every card and changed every lock. The next morning, the police knocked on my door. I am Paige, 34 years old, and a forensic accountant for a top-tier Chicago firm specializing in federal financial fraud. I also secretly own a highly lucrative private wealth consultancy, a fact my family knows absolutely nothing about. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your entire life upended by betrayal only to realize you held all the winning cards. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Chicago. I was scrubbing the marble countertops in our kitchen, wiping away the remnants of a dinner party I had hosted just 2 nights prior. Brendan, my husband of 6 years, had told me he was flying to Dallas for a tech sales conference. Instead, my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from him. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it. The text read, I am in Cancun with Nicole. We are in love. I ran away with her and we are never coming back. Figure your own life out. Most wives would collapse. Most would scream, throw their phone against the wall, or dissolve into a puddle of tears on the kitchen floor. I did not do any of those things. I simply stared at the message, feeling a cold, sharp wave of absolute clarity wash over me. Nicole was supposed to be my best friend. She was a luxury real estate agent who practically lived at our house, drinking my expensive wine and complaining about her terrible dating life. Now she was playing runaway bride with my husband. I typed exactly 2 words in response: good luck. I did not block his number. I wanted a permanent record of every stupid decision he was about to make. I walked straight to my home office, booted up my secured laptop, and accessed our joint banking portal. Brendan always thought my job as a forensic accountant was boring. He regularly called me a glorified calculator to his friends. What he did not understand was that boring number crunchers know exactly how to turn off the money tap. Within 4 minutes, I froze. Our joint checking account canceled his primary credit card and flagged his secondary cards for suspicious international activity. I knew exactly how much he relied on my income. His tech sales job barely covered his expensive car lease and his excessive bar tabs. I was the financial engine of our marriage, and I had just cut the fuel line. I picked up my phone again and dialed a 24-hour locksmith. By the time they arrived an hour later to swap out every deadbolt on my 4-bedroom house, I was already upstairs in the master bedroom, armed with heavy-duty garbage bags. I pulled open Brendan's closet doors and started yanking his designer suits off the hangers. He loved projecting the image of a highly successful tech executive, but his closet told the real story of our relationship. I grabbed the cheap gold-plated anniversary bracelet he had bought me last month from a mall kiosk and tossed it directly into the trash can. It clattered against the plastic bin, completely weightless. Then I caught sight of the empty velvet box on his dresser, the one that used to hold the custom Rolex I had purchased for his 35th birthday just weeks ago. I paid for his lifestyle. I funded his fragile ego. I carried the financial weight of our entire marriage while he played the big shot. I shoved his expensive golf polos and silk ties into the black plastic bags, dragging them one by one out to the curb in the pouring rain. Let him start his new life with Nicole using whatever he managed to pack in his carry-on suitcase. By midnight, the house was entirely mine. The new locks engaged with a satisfying heavy click. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet, sat on the living room sofa, and let the silence wash over me. I expected the next few days to be a messy blur of divorce lawyers and angry phone calls from his family. I anticipated Patricia, my toxic mother, calling to blame me for working too much and driving him away. She always told me that my obsession with numbers made me less of a woman. I fully expected my golden child sister Caroline to somehow make my divorce about her own anxiety, demanding I fix her financial problems while my personal life fell apart. I did not expect the loud, aggressive pounding on my front door at 7 in the morning. I tightened my robe and walked down the hallway, peering through the newly installed peephole. It was not Brendan crawling back, realizing his credit cards were declining at the swim-up bar. It was not Nicole trying to explain herself. Two men in dark windbreakers stood on my porch. When I opened the door, they immediately held up their federal badges. Ms. Page, one of the agents, said, his voice flat and authoritative. "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are not here about a missing persons report. We are here regarding a $2.5 million wire transfer executed yesterday afternoon from your husband's corporate escrow account to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands." I stared at him, my heart perfectly steady. "Your husband was detained at customs in Cancun 2 hours ago," the second agent added, his eyes narrowing as he carefully assessed my reaction. "And seeing as your digital signature is all over the transfer documents, we need you to come with us for questioning." The taller of the two men introduced himself as Agent Miller. Water dripped heavily from his jacket onto the polished oak floor of my foyer, but he made no move to apologize for the mess. Instead, he reached into his black leather briefcase and produced a thick manila folder. He stepped forward and slid a single sheet of paper across the cool granite surface of my kitchen island. He told me to look closely at the bottom line. It was a wire authorization form. The document clearly showed a transfer of $2.5 million moving directly from the corporate escrow account at Brendan's tech firm into an offshore holding company located in the Cayman Islands. Right below the routing numbers was my digital signature perfectly rendered, officially approving the release of the stolen funds. Agent Miller watched my face carefully, waiting for the panic to set in. He explained that Brendan was intercepted by customs officials at the Cancun International Airport just 2 hours ago. He was traveling with a one-way ticket, two burner phones, and a laptop full of encrypted financial records. Because my signature was the literal key that unlocked the escrow account, the Federal Bureau of Investigation considered me a primary accomplice in a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. The second agent stepped closer, positioning himself strategically between me and the front door, a subtle intimation that I was considered a flight risk. They expected tears. They expected a frantic denial, a trembling voice, or an immediate demand for a defense attorney. I did not give them any of that. I simply pulled out the velvet bar stool, sat down at the island, and asked them to give me exactly 4 minutes. I pulled my secured laptop from my work bag and flipped open the screen. My fingers flew across the keys quickly, bypassing the dual-factor authentication. I asked Agent Miller for the exact timestamp of the fraudulent signature. He checked his notes and stated it was executed yesterday afternoon at 2:14. I brought up my own secure network logs and turned the laptop so both agents could see the high-resolution screen. I pointed to the irrefutable data. At 2:14 yesterday afternoon, my computer was logged into a highly secure recorded video conference with a federal judge in downtown Chicago. I was testifying as an expert witness in a corporate fraud trial. The second agent leaned in, his eyes narrowing at the screen. I did not stop there. I told them I wanted to show them exactly where that signature originated. I ran a rapid tracer route on the IP address embedded in the metadata of the wire transfer document. It was a process I performed daily, a routine task that took me less than 60 seconds. The data cascaded down the screen, pinging from a local server and landing squarely on a commercial IP address. I pulled up the public registry for that specific IP block. The address belonged to a luxury real estate brokerage on the north side of the city. It was the exact office where Nicole worked. Agent Miller crossed his arms, his posture shifting from hostile to highly intrigued. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out the reality of the situation. I explained that Brendan was a mid-level software sales representative who barely knew how to reboot his own home router, let alone execute a clean offshore wire transfer. Nicole, however, was a real estate broker who handled digital mortgage authorizations every single day. She had access to specialized software that mapped and replicated digital signatures for remote property closings. Then I delivered the final blow to their theory. I stated my profession loud and clear. I am a senior forensic accountant. I specialize in tracking dark money and unraveling federal wire fraud for one of the top financial consultancy firms in the Midwest. I looked around my meticulously organized kitchen and told the agents that if I actually wanted to steal $2.5 million, I would never use a highly monitored corporate escrow account. Furthermore, I would certainly never flee to Mexico, a country that maintains a very active and efficient extradition treaty with the United States. Agent Miller stared at the cascading data on my screen, then looked up at me. A slow, genuine smirk spread across his face. The tension in the room dissolved instantly. He realized they were not standing in the kitchen of a desperate accomplice. They had just walked into the home of the perfect expert witness. The second agent closed his notepad, stepping away from his guarding position near the door. He asked if I could forward the network logs and the IP tracer route directly to their field office. I hit the send button before he even finished the sentence, transferring the encrypted files straight to their secure federal server. I explained that Brendan always thought my job was nothing more than boring spreadsheets. He constantly belittled my career to his friends, completely oblivious to the fact that I held elite cybersecurity clearances and spent my days hunting down criminals exactly like him. His arrogant assumption that I was just a predictable number cruncher was exactly what gave him the false confidence to try and frame me. That sheer ignorance just dug his federal grave. Agent Miller thanked me for my exceptional cooperation. He confirmed that I was officially cleared of any suspicion and promised to be in touch as they built the case against Brendan and Nicole. The two men turned toward the entryway, ready to head back out into the rain. Miller reached for the brass handle of the front door, but before his fingers could even turn the latch, the heavy oak door flew open from the outside. The door violently slammed against the interior wall, rattling the picture frames in the hallway. My mother, Patricia, stood on the porch. Her expensive trench coat was completely soaked, her perfectly styled hair plastered to her face, but her eyes were burning with an absolute unhinged fury. She did not even register the two men in federal windbreakers standing right in front of her. She marched straight past them, tracking mud across my clean floor, and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice echoed through the house in a piercing scream, accusing me of being a vindictive, jealous monster who just sent her perfect innocent son-in-law to rot in a Mexican prison. My mother did not even wait for the FBI agents to pull out of my driveway. She slammed her soaking wet designer handbag onto my pristine kitchen island with enough force to rattle the coffee mugs. Water dripped from her cashmere coat, pooling on the hardwood floor, but her absolute fury took up all the oxygen in the room. "You sent him to jail!" Patricia screamed, her voice vibrating with a shrill hysteria that I had known my entire life. "You vindictive, jealous little girl. You actually had your own husband locked up in a foreign country." I calmly walked over to the coffee maker and poured myself a fresh cup. "I did not send Brendan anywhere, Mother. He booked his own first-class ticket to Cancun using stolen corporate funds. The federal government detained him. I just happened to be the one who proved I had nothing to do with it." Patricia scoffed, waving her hand dismissively, as if I were talking about a misplaced credit card rather than grand larceny. She demanded that I stop playing the victim and fix the situation immediately. According to her twisted logic, Brendan was sitting in a Mexican holding cell surrounded by criminals, and it was entirely my responsibility to get him out. She slammed her palm against the granite countertop and ordered me to log into my bank account. "You have savings page. Do not lie to me," Patricia commanded, her eyes narrowing. "I know exactly how much you hoard away. You are going to call your bank right now, wire the $250,000 bail to the Mexican authorities, and bring your husband home before this turns into a public scandal." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. I explained to her, using the simplest terms possible, that Brendan had committed federal wire fraud. I told her that transferring $250,000 to a Mexican jurisdiction to bail out a fugitive would instantly trigger a Department of Justice investigation into my own finances. I would be arrested for aiding and abetting a fleeing felon. Patricia did not care about federal law. She cared about the country club. She cared about her Wednesday bridge group finding out her son-in-law was a criminal. She paced the length of my kitchen, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor, and spun the narrative the only way she knew how, by blaming me. "This is your fault anyway," she spat, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Your absolute obsession with numbers drove him away. You work 60 hours a week. You care more about your spreadsheets and your corporate audits than you ever cared about your own marriage. You drove him straight into Nicole's arms because you forgot how to be a wife. Before I could respond to that breathtaking level of delusion, Patricia marched into the adjacent hallway. She stopped in front of the gallery wall where I kept my professional credentials. Without a second thought, she reached up and snatched my framed Master of Science in Forensic Accounting right off the wall. The heavy wooden frame hit the floor with a loud thud. The glass did not shatter, but the impact echoed through the silent house. She kicked the frame aside with the toe of her leather boot. If you had focused on giving him children instead of earning this completely useless piece of paper, he would not have strayed. She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. A man needs a warm, welcoming home page. He needs a family. He does not need a human calculator who monitors every dime he spends. I looked down at my degree resting on the floor. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply walked over, picked up the frame, and wiped a smudge of dirt off the glass. I looked my mother dead in the eye and reminded her that this useless piece of paper was the exact reason I was able to write a $40,000 check to cover her luxury kitchen remodel last spring. I reminded her that my boring spreadsheets paid the mortgage on the house she was currently standing in, while Brendan contributed absolutely nothing but credit card debt and lies. Patricia's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the sound of the front door swinging open cut her off. Caroline marched into the foyer. My younger sister was 31, completely financially dependent on our mother, and wore oversized designer sunglasses despite the pouring rain outside. She carried herself with the frantic entitlement of someone who believed every minor inconvenience was a personal tragedy happening specifically to her. Following quietly behind her was Malik, her husband. Malik was a sharp, observant risk assessment analyst who rarely spoke during these family ambushes. He stood near the doorway, taking off his wet coat, his face an unreadable mask though his eyes darted, taking in the scene. Caroline did not even bother to say hello. She completely ignored the fact that my husband had just abandoned me for my best friend. She ignored the FBI visit. She stormed straight up to the kitchen island, slapped her hand on the counter, and let out an exasperated sigh. "Give me your car keys right now," Caroline demanded, holding her hand out expectantly. I stared at her extended palm, genuinely baffled by her audacity. I asked her why on earth she thought I was giving her the keys to my car. "Because my car is in the shop, and I am not taking an Uber in this weather," Caroline snapped, pulling off her sunglasses to glare at me. "I need to drive down to the retainer lawyer's office downtown immediately. Mom called me on the way over. We have to do damage control right this second before the entire city finds out you let your husband get arrested like a common thug. I have to go save this family's reputation because clearly you are just going to stand here and do nothing." Caroline aggressively wiggled her fingers, waiting for me to drop the keys into her hand. She truly believed that my imploding marriage and Brendan's federal crimes were simply obstacles getting in the way of her social life. I did not hand her the keys. I did not even blink. I just watched her throw her tantrum, realizing how perfectly Brendan had manipulated this exact dynamic. Malik, who had been standing silently by the front door this entire time, finally stepped forward. He did not look at Caroline. He looked straight at me. He casually kicked a dropped, crumpled piece of paper, a bank statement, across the floor, until it stopped right at the toe of my shoe. "Caroline," Malik said, his deep voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the kitchen. "Why do you not tell your sister about the $10,000 wire transfer you received from Nicole yesterday afternoon?" Caroline's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The oversized designer sunglasses she gripped in her hands slipped clattering loudly against the marble floor. The color entirely drained from her perfectly bronzed face. She stared at Malik, then at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, frantic terror. The air in the kitchen grew thick, heavy with the undeniable weight of the truth. Patricia looked between her golden child and Malik, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What on earth are you talking about, Malik?" Patricia demanded, her shrill voice dropping an octave as she tried to process the accusation. "What $10,000? Nicole is a real estate agent. Why would she be sending Caroline money?" Caroline did not give him a chance to answer. She lunged forward, grabbing our mother by the sleeve of her soaking wet cashmere coat. "We are leaving," Caroline blurted out, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. "This is ridiculous. Paige is clearly delusional, and now she is trying to turn my own husband against me. We need to go see the lawyer right now." Patricia stumbled as Caroline practically dragged her toward the foyer. Patricia tried to protest, demanding an explanation, but Caroline was already shoving her out the heavy oak door and into the pouring rain. The door clicked shut, leaving a sudden ringing silence in my kitchen. Malik did not move to follow them. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored slacks. He listened to the frantic sound of Caroline's car engine roaring to life in the driveway and tires screeching against the wet pavement. Only when the noise faded down the street did he finally release a long, heavy exhale. He walked over to the kitchen island and picked up the bank statement he had kicked across the floor. He smoothed out the creases and laid it flat on the granite counter right next to my coffee mug. "It cleared this morning," Malik said, his voice flat and steady. "Nicole wired it directly from her personal checking account into Caroline's secret boutique fund. Brendan instructed her to send it as an advance payment to keep Caroline quiet about the affair. Caroline knew about Brendan and Nicole for 3 entire months, Paige. She took the hush money to fund her imaginary business while smiling in your face at Sunday dinners." I stared at the black and white numbers on the page. The betrayal did not break my heart. It just calcified the ice already running through my veins. My sister sold my marriage and my trust for the price of a commercial lease deposit. Malik leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. He looked exhausted, the weight of his toxic marriage finally showing in the deep lines around his eyes. "You need to lock down every single asset you own," he warned, his tone dead serious. "They are not just going to the lawyer to do damage control for Brendan. They are going there to figure out how to force you to liquidate this house." I scoffed, shaking my head. "They have absolutely no legal claim to my property or my finances. They do not care about the law." Paige, Malik countered, his gaze intense. "Patricia convinced Caroline that since you are legally married to Brendan, his debts are your debts. Brendan promised Caroline $50,000, and Patricia wants his bail paid to avoid a country club scandal. They plan to petition a judge to freeze your accounts and force a sale of this property to cover Brendan's legal fees and Caroline's boutique lease. They think you will cave to public pressure and family guilt." Malik stood up straight, his jaw tight. "I have been married to your sister for 5 years. For 5 years, I have watched this family treat you like a walking ATM. I sat quietly at the dinner table when your mother drained your college fund to pay for our lavish wedding. I kept my mouth shut when they demanded you co-sign loans for cars Brendan could not afford. I convinced myself it was not my place to intervene in your family dynamics." He reached for his coat, sliding it over his shoulders. "But receiving a wire transfer from a fugitive who just embezzled federal funds crosses a massive line. I am a risk assessment analyst. I know exactly what federal accessory charges look like, and I track financial anomalies for a living. I refuse to be complicit in a criminal conspiracy just to fund Caroline's shopping habits. I am filing for divorce tomorrow. Get a ruthless lawyer, Paige. They are coming for everything you have." With that, Malik turned and walked out the front door, closing it quietly behind him. The house fell completely silent once again. The chaotic storm of my family had blown through, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard facts. I picked up the bank statement, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the manila folder the FBI agents had left behind. I had all the evidence I needed to completely destroy them. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk, pulling up the contact information for the most aggressive divorce attorney in Chicago. Before my fingers could even touch the keyboard, the sharp, jarring ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet. The caller ID displayed a blocked international number. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. An automated robotic voice immediately filled the line. "You have a collect call from a federal detention center in Quintana Roo, Mexico. Press 1 to accept charges." I pressed 1. Paige, Brendan's voice hissed through the static-filled line. He did not sound apologetic. He did not sound terrified. He sounded absolutely enraged. I did not say a word. I just waited. You listen to me very carefully, he snarled, his voice echoing slightly in whatever concrete room he was locked inside. You are going to wire that bail money right now. I know exactly what you do on the side. I know all about your highly lucrative private wealth consultancy. I know you hide money from your firm and from the IRS. If you do not get me out of here by tonight, I am telling the federal prosecutors everything. I will drag you down right into this cell with me. I held the phone tight against my ear, listening to the harsh metallic static of the international prison line. Brendan was breathing heavily on the other end. He was trying to sound intimidating, attempting to project the authority of a cornered apex predator, but I could easily detect the slight frantic tremor of panic beneath his rage. He genuinely believed his threat about exposing my private wealth consultancy would instantly force my hand. He thought I was hiding money illegally, projecting his own criminal mindset onto my perfectly legitimate tax-compliant business structure. I did not interrupt him. I let the silence stretch across the thousands of miles of fiber optic cable, allowing his anxiety to simmer in the quiet. When I refused to beg or panic, Brendan's tone shifted from furious to violently smug. He let out a sharp, grating laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of whatever holding cell he was currently occupying. He told me that my little secret consultancy was just the appetizer. He bragged that he and Nicole had spent the last 6 months orchestrating a financial coup right under my nose, and they had already secured the ultimate leverage. He laid out his master plan with a sickening sense of pride. He explained that Nicole had utilized her elite position as a luxury real estate broker to access secure top-tier lending portals. She bypassed the standard verification protocols, using her professional credentials, leveraging her agency's trusted reputation, and a corrupt notary she frequently employed for high-end closings. Together, they had taken out a massive, highly leveraged second mortgage on our 4-bedroom Chicago home. Brendan practically purred into the receiver as he detailed how easily they had manipulated me. He mocked my rigid, predictable routines with absolute disdain. He told me how pathetic I looked sitting at the kitchen island every single Sunday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, cross-referencing our joint checking accounts and diligently organizing digital receipts. He said my obsession with numbers made me completely blind to the real world. He boasted that my insistence on tracking his petty gas station purchases and minor dry cleaning bills made it incredibly easy to pull off a multi-million-dollar property heist right behind my back. While I was busy monitoring the small change he and Nicole were intercepting, physical mail spoofing digital mortgage approvals, and draining the equity out of the very roof over my head. You always thought you were the smartest person in the room, Paige. Brendan sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You thought you controlled every single aspect of our lives because you controlled the bank accounts. But Nicole and I played you. She sat in your living room drinking your expensive wine while legally signing away your precious sanctuary. He then delivered his final, desperate ultimatum. The funds from that fraudulent second mortgage were currently sitting in a frozen offshore account alongside the embezzled corporate money. However, the lending bank would be demanding their first massive repayment by the end of the week. Brendan told me that if I did not immediately wire $250,000 to the Mexican federal police to secure his release, he would simply let the bank foreclose on the property. You have until Friday, he threatened, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Pay my bail right now or you lose the house. You lose your pristine professional reputation. You will be sleeping on the streets, and I will make sure every single one of your wealthy consultancy clients knows that their brilliant financial advisor got scammed out of her own home by her husband and her best friend. I stood in my home office, looking out the window at the relentless Chicago rain pouring down on the street below. I absorbed his entire unhinged monologue. I listened to the satisfying sound of a man who thought he had just played a brilliant, flawless game of chess, completely unaware that we were not even playing on the same board. I took a slow, deep breath of the quiet, cool air in my house. Then I laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle or a hysterical reaction to trauma. It was a genuine, deep laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement. The sheer stupidity of his grand master plan was breathtaking. Brendan stopped talking immediately. The line went dead silent save for the crackle of the international connection. "What is so funny?" he demanded, the smugness instantly evaporating from his voice, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of terror. I walked over to my desk and traced my fingers over the polished mahogany surface. I adjusted my grip on the phone and delivered the crushing reality of his situation, dismantling his entire 6-month conspiracy in 3 sentences. "You really do not understand what I do for a living, Brendan," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "I hunt down corporate fraudsters and asset strippers every single day. Do you honestly believe I would leave my primary residence vulnerable to an attack? My house has not been in my personal name for over 2 years." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but I did not stop to let him process the incoming devastation. I transferred the deed to a highly secure anonymous limited liability company registered in Wyoming. I explained, enunciating every single word so the reality would fully penetrate his skull. "I am the sole managing member of Obsidian Holdings, LLC. That means Nicole forged a personal signature on a corporate deed that legally does not exist in the capacity she thought it did." The silence from the Mexican holding cell was absolute. I could practically hear the remaining pieces of his shattered life collapsing around him. "The bank is not going to foreclose on me, Brendan. The bank's internal fraud department is going to trigger a massive federal alert. The second their automated system realizes the entity names do not match the forged authorization documents. Nicole did not steal my equity. Nicole just committed federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and gross misuse of a commercial broker's license for absolutely nothing." I hung up the phone before Brendan could utter another sound. The satisfying click of the receiver cutting off his desperate panic was the best sound I had heard all week. I stood in my office processing the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. Brendan genuinely believed he held all the cards, completely unaware that he had just confessed to federal bank fraud on a recorded prison line. I was about to call my attorney when the loud crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway broke my concentration. I walked to the front window and pulled back the sheer curtain. Patricia had returned. She stepped out of a black town car, shielding her perfect hair from the pouring rain with a massive designer umbrella. Following closely behind her was a man in a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his chest. He reeked of cheap cologne and desperation. I walked out to the foyer just as Patricia threw open the front door. She marched inside without wiping her shoes, tracking mud and rainwater across the polished marble tiles I had spent hours restoring. The lawyer stepped in behind her, looking incredibly nervous, but attempting to project a hollow sense of authority. Patricia did not bother with pleasantries. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her expression twisted into a mask of pure entitlement. "You are completely out of time, Paige," she declared, her voice echoing aggressively off the high ceilings. "I am not playing your stubborn little games anymore. Caroline is practically hyperventilating at home, and Brendan is rotting in a filthy foreign jail cell because you refuse to fulfill your basic duties as a wife and a sister." I crossed my arms and looked at the sweating man standing behind her. I asked her who she had brought into my home. "This is Mr. Vance," Patricia announced, proudly gesturing to the man. "He is a highly aggressive property litigation specialist. Since you are legally bound to Brendan, Mr. Vance has drafted an emergency power of attorney and a forced sale agreement. You are going to sign the deed of this house over to an independent family trust immediately. We will liquidate the asset, pay Brendan's bail, secure the commercial lease for Caroline's boutique, and you can figure out your own living situation. It is the only way to save this family from complete public humiliation." I stared at Patricia, genuinely amazed by the depths of her delusion. I asked her why she thought I would ever sign away my home to save a man who had abandoned me for my best friend. Patricia rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the hallway. "Do not play the victim here," she snapped, taking a step closer. "Brendan seeking comfort elsewhere was completely inevitable. You drove him directly into Nicole's arms." I kept my expression entirely neutral, prompting her to keep talking. She took the bait effortlessly. "You think you are so perfect because of your money and your fancy corporate career?" Patricia sneered, her voice dripping with venom. But you are cold. You are calculating. A man like Brendan needs warmth. He needs someone who actually pays attention to him. Nicole understands that. She knows how to make a man feel valued and respected. I asked Patricia exactly how she knew what Nicole understood about my husband. Patricia's face flushed a deep crimson, but her arrogance pushed her forward. Because they came to my house for dinner 3 months ago, she blurted out, her chin raised in defiance. I cooked them a beautiful roast. They sat at my dining room table holding hands and told me they were deeply in love. And honestly, it made perfect sense. Nicole is a much better fit for him. She wants to be a traditional wife. She actually listens to him instead of analyzing his bank statements and treating him like an employee. I gave them my blessing because Brendan deserves true happiness, even if he had to look outside his miserable marriage to find it. The room went entirely still. Mr. Vance shifted uncomfortably, clutching his briefcase tighter against his chest as if to shield himself from the toxic radiation pouring out of my mother. I let the horrific words settle into the quiet space between us. My own mother had hosted my husband and my best friend for a romantic dinner while I was working late to pay off the very credit cards Brendan had maxed out. She had known about their ultimate betrayal for an entire financial quarter and had actively encouraged it. She had sat across from them drinking wine paid for by my labor, plotting my downfall. "Sign the papers," Patricia demanded, completely misinterpreting my silence as defeat. "Sign them right now or I will publicly disown you. I will tell everyone at the country club, everyone in our social circle, and every single one of your wealthy consultancy clients what a petty, vindictive, unhinged woman you really are. I will make sure your professional reputation in this city is completely destroyed. You will have absolutely nothing and no one." I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply nodded. I turned around, walked into my home office, and grabbed a heavy black fountain pen from my desk. I also picked up a thick, sealed manila envelope that the federal agents had specifically left with me earlier that morning. I walked back into the foyer and stood directly in front of Mr. Vance. He fumbled with the brass clasps of his briefcase and pulled out a stack of hastily printed legal documents. He handed them to me, pointing to the bottom line with a trembling finger. "Sign exactly where the yellow sticky flags indicate miss," he muttered clearly, eager to collect his fee and escape the tension. I took the documents. I did not even bother reading the absolute legal fiction Mr. Vance had typed up. I knew they were entirely unenforceable, especially since the house belonged to an anonymous holding company, not me personally. I placed the papers against the wall and signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I handed the stack of worthless paper back to the sweating lawyer. Patricia let out a loud, triumphant sigh. Finally, she muttered, adjusting the collar of her cashmere coat. "You finally did something sensible for once in your life. Now get your things packed. I want you out by Friday morning so the real estate agent can start showing the property to prospective buyers." I looked at Patricia, a freezing, dead smile forming on my lips. "I am not going anywhere, Patricia," I said calmly. "But you certainly are." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the sealed manila envelope. I slapped it firmly against Mr. Vance's chest. He reflexively grabbed it, looking down in complete confusion. "Read it," I instructed him, my voice leaving no room for argument. Mr. Vance tore open the seal. His eyes scanned the heavy watermarked federal paper inside. I watched as the color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His mouth fell open and his hands began to shake so violently that the thick paper rattled audibly in the quiet foyer. He looked at Patricia, then back at the paper, sheer panic radiating from his wide eyes. "What is it?" Patricia demanded, annoyed by his sudden paralysis. "Is there a typo in the deed transfer? Fix it immediately." Mr. Vance swallowed hard, taking a slow, terrified step away from my mother, as if she had suddenly caught fire. He looked at me with absolute horror, recognizing exactly what kind of trap he had just walked into. "This is not a deed transfer," he whispered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I smiled warmly at my mother. "I told you federal agents were here this morning, Patricia. They were not just investigating Brendan for embezzlement. They were tracking the illicit wire transfers he made using stolen corporate funds." Specifically, they were tracking the massive untaxed transfers he routed directly through your personal checking accounts to hide the money before fleeing the country. Patricia froze, the arrogant sneer completely vanishing from her face. Mr. Vance held up the paper, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "Ma'am," he stammered, looking at my mother with wide, fearful eyes. "You have just been served with a federal subpoena. The United States Department of Justice is indicting you for money laundering and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Mr. Vance practically threw the heavy watermarked paper back at my mother. He backed away so quickly that his heel caught the edge of my vintage runner rug, sending him stumbling backward toward the heavy oak door. He did not care about retrieving his dignity. He cared about putting as much physical distance between himself and a federal money laundering indictment as humanly possible. "I am retained strictly for residential property disputes," Mr. Vance stammered, his voice cracking as he fumbled blindly for the brass doorknob behind him. "I have absolutely no involvement in federal wire fraud. I am officially withdrawing my representation effective immediately. Do not contact my office." He hauled the door open and bolted into the driving rain, sprinting toward his town car without even bothering to open his umbrella. The tires spun wildly on the wet pavement as his driver gunned the engine, speeding away and leaving Patricia standing entirely alone in my foyer. Patricia stared at the crumpled document in her hands. Her perfectly manicured fingers shook, but the rigid lines of her face quickly hardened into a mask of pure, stubborn denial. She aggressively smoothed out the paper, her eyes scanning the terrifying legal jargon. Instead of absorbing the reality of a United States Department of Justice subpoena, she immediately reverted to her favorite defense mechanism. She blamed me. "This is a forgery," Patricia hissed, taking a threatening step forward. "You printed this in your little home office to scare me. You think you can use your accounting tricks to intimidate me into letting Brendan rot in Mexico? I will have you arrested for impersonating a federal officer, Paige." Before I could point out the absurdity of her threat, the sound of a second car roaring up my driveway interrupted us. Car doors slammed violently. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded up the front porch stairs. Caroline burst through the front door, completely ignoring the fact that she was dripping rainwater all over the floor. She shoved past our mother, her face blotchy and red, her chest heaving with exertion. She held her smartphone out like a weapon, shoving the glowing screen directly into my face. "Fix it!" Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls. "Fix it right now, Paige. I went to the bank to wire the deposit for my boutique, and the teller told me my entire account is under a federal freeze. They locked up my savings. They locked up the $10,000 Nicole sent me. They even froze my credit cards. Call whoever you need to call and unfreeze my money." I looked at my younger sister, amazed by her absolute inability to grasp the severity of the situation. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe of my office, letting a cold, humorless smile settle on my face. "I cannot unfreeze your accounts, Caroline," I explained, keeping my tone deadly calm. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation froze them. They tend to do that when a citizen accepts a $10,000 bribe funded by stolen corporate money." "It was not a bribe," Caroline screamed, stomping her foot like a petulant toddler. "It was an advance. Brendan told Nicole to send it to me to secure my commercial lease. He was being supportive of my dreams." "Nicole is a luxury real estate broker," Caroline, I stated, dropping the final crushing piece of the puzzle into place. "She does not hand out $10,000 business grants to unemployed women. She paid you for a service." When Brendan and Nicole realized my house was locked inside a corporate LLC and they could not forge my signature to steal my equity, they needed a backup plan. They needed a clean, wealthy financial profile to secure an offshore bridge loan to fund their escape. They needed a pristine Social Security number, decades of perfect credit history, and verified tax returns. Patricia turned slowly to look at Caroline, the subpoena still trembling in her hand. Her brow furrowed as my words finally began to penetrate her wall of denial. They could not use their own profiles because Brendan was already drowning in debt. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Caroline's terrified face. And Nicole knew any sudden massive loan applications would trigger an alert at her brokerage. But you, Caroline, had direct access to the perfect candidate. You live in Patricia's house. You have the password to her safe. You process her mail. You sold our mother's identity to my husband's mistress for $10,000. Caroline let out a high, panicked gasp. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. I did not sell anything, she cried out defensively. Nicole told me she just needed a wealthy character reference to push the boutique lease through faster. She gave me some forms to fill out online. I just copied the numbers from Mom's tax returns. Nicole said it was a standard background check. I did not know she was taking out a loan. Patricia gasped, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over her face, stripping away years of carefully maintained arrogance. Her golden child, the daughter she had coddled and funded and protected, had handed over her entire financial identity to criminals for the price of a cheap commercial lease deposit. But Patricia's desperate need to preserve her flawless worldview was a powerful, blinding force. She looked at Caroline's sobbing face, then snapped her gaze back to me. The panic in her eyes instantly morphed into vicious defensive rage. "This is your doing!" Patricia screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Caroline is a good, loyal girl. She would never commit identity theft against her own mother. You orchestrated this entire thing, Paige. You used your miserable spreadsheets and your corporate audits to frame your own sister. You are a cold, calculating machine. You moved your house into a shell company. You tracked Brendan's accounts. You set us all up to take the fall because you could not stand the fact that your husband loved someone warmer and kinder than you." She took a breath, practically vibrating with indignation. "Nicole is a respected professional. She is a top-tier broker. She would never ruin her career to steal from me." I did not bother arguing with a woman determined to go down with a sinking ship. Instead, I turned around, picked up the television remote resting on the console table, and pointed it at the massive flat screen mounted in the living room. I pressed the power button and unmuted the volume. The midday local news broadcast filled the room. The anchor was speaking urgently over live sweeping helicopter footage of a sleek glass-fronted office building in downtown Chicago. The banner across the bottom of the screen flashed in bright red letters. Breaking news: FBI raids elite luxury real estate brokerage in massive wire fraud and identity theft ring. The camera cut to a ground-level shot. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed across the back were carrying heavy boxes of hard drives and files out of the building. Then the camera zoomed in tight on the glass revolving doors. Two armed agents emerged, flanking a woman wearing a tailored designer suit. Her hands were secured firmly behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs. Her head was bowed, her blonde hair falling forward to hide her face from the flashing cameras of the local press. Patricia and Caroline stood frozen in my foyer, staring blankly at the television screen as Nicole was shoved unceremoniously into the back of a federal vehicle. The local news broadcast cut to a jarringly cheerful commercial for car insurance. But the image of Nicole being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle remained burned into the retinas of my mother and sister. Patricia and Caroline did not say another word. The absolute reality of federal indictments and FBI raids had finally pierced their bubble of suburban entitlement. They practically tripped over each other, rushing out the front door, fleeing my house, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. I spent the rest of the day in absolute peace, listening to the rain beat against the windows while I organized my financial files and prepared for the inevitable fallout. The next morning dawned crisp and bitterly cold. I was standing in the kitchen at 8 o'clock, perfectly adhering to the Sunday routine Brendan had mocked so viciously when the sound of the front door unlocking echoed down the hallway. I did not jump. I knew exactly who held the only other spare key to this house. Nicole stepped into my foyer. She did not look like a woman who had spent the previous afternoon being fingerprinted and processed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat, her blonde hair freshly blown out, and a pair of oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses pushed up onto her head. She moved with the arrogant floating grace of someone who believed her family's vast wealth was an impenetrable shield against the consequences of reality. "Did you honestly think a little televised raid was going to keep me down, Paige?" Nicole asked, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension as she walked into the living room. I set down my pen and leaned against the granite kitchen island watching her perform. I asked her how she managed to walk out of federal custody so quickly. My father's legal team had my bail posted before midnight, Nicole bragged, tossing her designer handbag onto my pristine velvet sofa. They are the best defense attorneys in the state. They are already drafting a statement categorizing the forged mortgage documents as a minor administrative oversight by a junior clerk at my brokerage. The federal prosecutors will look at my family's political connections, look at the cost of taking this to trial, and they will plead it down to a misdemeanor with a modest fine. She paced across the hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking rhythmically, projecting a frantic energy that contradicted her confident words. She needed me to believe she was untouchable because deep down the terror of that holding cell was still clawing at her throat. "You overplayed your hand, Paige," she continued, a cruel smirk twisting her flawless features. "You thought you could trap Brendan in Mexico and trap me in a cell. But my father is paying Brendan's bail today. The Mexican authorities will release him by sunset. We are a team. We are going to weather this little storm, and by next month we will be lying on a beach in St. Bart's, while you sit alone in this big, empty house obsessing over your miserable spreadsheets. I still have Brendan. I won." Nicole walked towards the hallway connecting the living room to the formal dining room. She stopped in front of the console table and reached out, running her French manicured fingernails along the rim of a heavy Murano crystal vase I had purchased during a business trip to Venice. "I always absolutely hated this vase," Nicole said casually, tapping the crystal so it let out a sharp, ringing chime. "Actually, I hated this entire house. It is so rigid and boring, just like you." She turned to face me, dropping all pretense of the friendship we had shared for 7 years. Her eyes were hard and glittering with malice. "Do you remember all those Friday wine nights we used to have right here in your living room?" she asked, her voice mocking. "You would pour $100 bottles of Bordeaux and talk for hours about your corporate audits and your financial goals. You thought we were bonding. But the truth is, I only came over to laugh at you. Brendan and I would exchange looks right across your kitchen island while you went on and on about your retirement portfolios. As soon as you went upstairs to sleep, we would sit on this very couch and mock how utterly clueless you were. You gave me the keys to your house, the keys to your life, and you never even realized I was the one keeping your husband entertained because you forgot how to be a woman." She stood there breathing heavily, waiting for my reaction. She wanted tears. She wanted me to scream, to throw something, to validate her victory by showing her my devastation. She needed me to break so she could feel whole. I did not scream. I did not blink. I simply turned around and walked over to the espresso machine on the back counter. "Coffee, Nicole?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant and conversational. She blinked, completely thrown off balance by my lack of hysteria. Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, crossing her arms defensively. "I suppose I have time for a cup before my driver returns," she sneered. I took down 2 ceramic mugs and began pouring the dark, steaming coffee. I placed them on the kitchen island and gestured for her to sit on the bar stool opposite me. She approached cautiously, clearly unnerved by my absolute calm, but her arrogance forced her to sit down and accept the cup. I watched her take a sip, savoring the moment. Her father's money had bought her temporary freedom, and her delusion had convinced her that she had outsmarted a federal indictment. She truly believed her wealthy pedigree shielded her from the brutal machinery of the justice system. I reached into the leather briefcase resting on the floor next to my stool. I bypassed the folders containing Brendan's wire transfers and Caroline's bank statements. I pulled out a single thick document secured in a navy blue legal jacket. I placed the document flat on the marble counter. I placed my hand flat over the cover and looked Nicole dead in the eyes. "Your father's legal team is incredibly efficient at posting bail, Nicole," I agreed, my tone conversational and light. "And you are entirely correct that wealthy families usually manage to plead down white-collar crimes by leveraging their massive commercial assets and political donations. It is a very predictable defense strategy." I slowly slid the heavy legal document across the smooth marble island until it bumped gently against the base of her coffee mug. The problem with that strategy, I continued, my voice dropping to a low razor-sharp register, is that it requires your father to actually own the commercial assets he intends to leverage. Nicole stared at the navy blue cover. She did not reach for it. Her breathing hitched, the confident smirk totally vanishing from her face as she looked back up at me with sudden wide-eyed dread. "You spent the last 6 months laughing at my boring spreadsheets, Nicole," I said, leaning forward slightly. "But you never bothered to ask what I actually do with the massive amounts of private wealth I manage." I tapped the cover of the document with my index finger. "Read it," I instructed her quietly. "It is the finalized corporate ownership transfer for your father's entire commercial real estate holding company. Obsidian Holdings, LLC, just finalized a hostile acquisition of his debt portfolio at 6 o'clock yesterday evening. Your father does not have the assets to bribe a federal prosecutor anymore, Nicole, because I own his company." Nicole stared at the heavy navy blue folder resting on the marble counter. Her hands remained frozen in her lap. She refused to touch it, as if the physical act of opening the cover would somehow make the words inside true. I did not rush her. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and waited for her fragile reality to completely fracture. Finally, her trembling fingers reached out. She flipped open the cover. Her eyes darted aggressively across the first page, scanning the bold legal headers, the acquisition summaries, and the unmistakable seal of the State Commerce Commission. She flipped to the second page, then the third. The color drained from her face in absolute sheets, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent white. She stared at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. She saw my name signed cleanly over the title of Managing Director of Obsidian Holdings, LLC. "This is a complete fabrication," Nicole choked out, her voice entirely stripped of its previous arrogant melody. "You are an accountant, Paige. You sit in a cubicle. You do not have the capital to execute a corporate takeover of my father's holding company. He is worth hundreds of millions of dollars." I smiled, setting my coffee mug down with a soft clink. "That is the fundamental misunderstanding you and Brendan both shared about my career," I explained calmly. "You thought forensic accounting was just adding up columns and balancing boring spreadsheets. But my job has never been about simply counting money. My job is about finding exactly where wealthy people hide their money, analyzing the structural weaknesses in their corporate empires, and understanding exactly how those empires collapse." Nicole gripped the edge of the kitchen island, her knuckles turning bone white. She could not tear her eyes away from the documents. "While you two were sitting on my sofa drinking my wine and laughing at how boring I was, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. I was quietly building a private wealth management firm. I spent the last 7 years taking the massive commissions I earned from untangling corporate fraud and rolling them into high-yield anonymous investments. I accumulated real capital, Nicole, real power. And when Brendan started coming home reeking of your perfume, I decided to take a very close look at your family's finances." Nicole shook her head violently, but she could not formulate a coherent sentence. "Your father is not worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Nicole," I stated, dismantling her entire identity piece by piece. "His entire commercial real estate portfolio is a massive, over-leveraged house of cards. He used properties he did not fully own as collateral to buy more properties he could not afford. When the commercial market dipped last year, he defaulted on 3 massive bridge loans. The banks were quietly preparing to seize his assets. I simply stepped in through Obsidian Holdings and bought up his debt for pennies on the dollar. I own the paper on every single building your family controls." She stared at me, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. "But my brokerage is independent," she stammered, clinging desperately to her last remaining shred of pride. "My firm is not part of his commercial portfolio. You cannot touch my business." I tapped the legal jacket resting in front of her. "Turn to page 7, section 4, I instructed. She scrambled to turn the pages, her French manicured fingernails tearing the thick paper in her haste. Her eyes locked onto the highlighted paragraph. "Your father was desperate for liquidity 3 months ago," I explained, watching the absolute horror wash over her face. "He needed cash to prevent a total margin call. So he quietly bundled your elite luxury brokerage into the holding company and used it as collateral for a final high-risk loan, a loan that I personally funded through a proxy firm. When he missed his payment yesterday afternoon, I executed the default clause. I did not just acquire his commercial buildings, Nicole. I acquired the parent company of your real estate brokerage. I own the desk you sit at. I own the logo on your business cards. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy rain lashing against the kitchen windows. Nicole was practically hyperventilating, her perfectly blown-out hair now clinging to the cold sweat forming on her forehead. The realization that she was no longer a wealthy heiress, but a pawn entirely owned by the woman she had mocked, was breaking her mind. "So as your new employer, I have some administrative matters to discuss," I said, keeping my tone exceptionally polite. "Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause. You are officially stripped of your position as senior broker. Your real estate license is currently under review by the state board, and your access to the corporate offices has been permanently revoked." "You cannot do this!" Nicole screamed suddenly, standing up so fast her bar stool tipped backward and crashed against the hardwood floor. "You cannot take my firm. I am a partner." "You were a partner," I corrected her gently. "Now you are an unemployed criminal under federal investigation. Which brings me to the second administrative matter. When Obsidian Holdings took over your brokerage last night, I gained total unrestricted administrative access to the corporate servers." Nicole froze. Her aggressive posture instantly collapsed. "You thought you were being so clever when you deleted all those internal emails between you and Brendan," I said, leaning forward across the marble island. "You thought wiping your outbox would hide the fact that you used company funds to facilitate his embezzlement. But forensic accountants know that corporate servers run daily hard backups. It took my IT team exactly 4 minutes to restore your deleted folders." "Please," Nicole whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. Her knees visibly wobbled. "I have already packaged every single email, every hidden wire transfer log, and every falsified client record you thought you destroyed." I continued, my voice leaving absolutely no room for mercy. "I handed the entire digital portfolio directly to the FBI task force handling your case at 8 o'clock this morning. They do not have to negotiate a plea deal with your father's expensive defense team anymore, Nicole. They have your written confessions on company servers. You are going to federal prison." Nicole opened her mouth to beg, but before she could formulate a single word, a sharp, jarring ringtone pierced the quiet kitchen. We both looked down at her designer handbag resting on the sofa in the living room. The phone rang again, loud and frantic. Nicole stumbled away from the kitchen island, her legs barely supporting her weight. She dug into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out her glowing smartphone. I watched from the kitchen as she answered the call and brought the device to her ear. "Dad," Nicole gasped into the receiver, tears freely streaming down her flawless cheeks. "Dad, you have to fix this. You have to stop her." I watched Nicole's face completely shatter. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a loud crack as the voice on the other end continued to shout in absolute panic. Her father could not fix anything. Her father had just called to tell her that the federal government had stepped in and completely frozen every single one of their family's bank accounts. Nicole stared at the shattered screen of her phone on the floor. The dial tone buzzed faintly from the speaker, a harsh electronic drone in the suddenly quiet room. Without another word, she scrambled to her feet, snatched her pristine white coat, and bolted out the front door, leaving her designer handbag sitting entirely abandoned on my velvet sofa. The sound of her frantic footsteps faded quickly into the freezing rain. I calmly picked up my coffee mug and took another sip, savoring the absolute silence of my house. The peace lasted exactly 12 minutes. The heavy oak door swung open again. Caroline stumbled into the foyer, looking nothing like the perfectly put-together boutique owner she pretended to be. Her expensive raincoat was misbuttoned, her hair was plastered wetly to her face, and her mascara was smeared in dark, chaotic rings under her eyes. She did not bother wiping her boots. She marched straight into the kitchen and slammed a stack of crumpled, rain-soaked letters onto the marble island right where Nicole's corporate termination papers had just been resting. "You have to call them!" Caroline gasped, clutching her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. You have to call your contacts, or the banks, or whoever you work for. You have to fix this right now, Paige. I did not touch the wet papers. I looked down at the bold, terrifying letterhead visible on the top document. It was a formal audit notice from the Internal Revenue Service. I cannot call the IRS, Caroline, I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion as I looked at her panicking face. They do not take polite phone requests to unfreeze accounts linked to active federal investigations. Caroline let out a shrill, hysterical sob. She grabbed the edge of the island, her knuckles turning bone white. It was just $10,000, she cried out, her voice echoing shrilly. People transfer $10,000 all the time. Nicole said it was a gift. She said it was a private investment in my boutique. How was I supposed to know the money was stolen from Brendan's company? How was I supposed to know they would track the wire directly to my personal checking account? Because federal banks automatically report any unexplained cash deposits of $10,000 or more, I explained, watching her unravel. Especially when that deposit is immediately followed by fraudulent offshore mortgage applications using a stolen social security number. You triggered a massive automated federal audit. They are going to scrub every single financial transaction you have made for the last 10 years. Caroline's knees literally gave out. She sank to the hardwood floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest and beginning to hyperventilate. Her breathing came in short, jagged gasps. She squeezed her eyes shut and began rocking back and forth, performing the exact same theatrical routine she had perfected when we were teenagers. I cannot breathe, Caroline whimpered, staring up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. Paige, my anxiety is spiking. You know how bad my chest gets. I am having a medical emergency. You have to fix this for me. Please. You are the smart one. You know how to manipulate numbers and hide things. Just log into their system and make it look like a clerical error. You have to save me. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I did not kneel beside her. I did not offer her a glass of water. You used this exact same performance the night before your AP history final in high school, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the large kitchen. You sat on the floor of my bedroom, crying and hyperventilating, claiming your anxiety was going to put you in the hospital. You put on such a spectacular show that I stayed up until 4 a.m. writing your term paper so you would not fail. You did it again when you overdrafted your first credit card in college. You cried, you shook, and I paid the balance from my tutoring money to save you from Patricia's wrath. You have spent your entire life using your manufactured anxiety as currency to buy my labor. Caroline's rocking slowly stopped, her jagged gasps hitched, sounding suddenly much less authentic as she realized her weapon was useless. I am not doing your homework anymore, Caroline, I said, looking down at her tear-stained face. I am not paying your debts. And I am certainly not committing federal perjury to save you from the consequences of selling our mother's identity to my husband's mistress. Caroline scrambled to her feet, dropping the Fragile Victim Act instantly. Her face flushed with bitter, defensive rage. You are a monster, she spat, swiping angrily at her ruined mascara. I am your sister. Malik and I are going to lose our house. The IRS is going to seize our joint accounts. You are going to let my husband go bankrupt because you are too stubborn to help your own flesh and blood. Leave Malik out of this. A deep, exhausted voice rumbled from the foyer. Caroline whipped around, her jaw dropping open in shock. I looked past her shoulder to see Malik standing just inside the doorway. He was wearing a heavy winter jacket completely soaked from the rain. In his right hand, he gripped the handle of a large hard-shell suitcase. His face was drawn and pale, carrying the exhausted weight of a man who had finally woken up from a long, terrible dream. Malik, Caroline stammered, her voice instantly dropping an octave as she tried to project innocence. What are you doing here? Why do you have your luggage? Malik walked slowly into the kitchen, ignoring his wife entirely. He did not look angry. He just looked thoroughly, permanently done. He set the heavy suitcase down on the floor with a dull thud. The federal agents showed up at my architectural firm this morning, Caroline, Malik said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. They pulled me out of a client meeting. They asked me to explain why my wife was transferring thousands of dollars to offshore holding accounts. They asked me if I was aware that my joint checking account was being used to launder embezzled corporate funds. Caroline reached out trying to grab his arm. Malik, baby, it was a mistake. Nicole tricked me. I did not know what I was doing. Malik pulled his arm away so violently that Caroline stumbled backward. Do not touch me, he warned, his voice cracking with betrayed disgust. You dragged me into a federal crime. You risked my career, my architectural license, and my freedom because you wanted a fast shortcut to opening a boutique you were never qualified to run. I spent the entire morning sitting in an interrogation room proving to the FBI that I had absolutely no knowledge of your transactions. Where are you going? Caroline cried out, fresh tears welling in her eyes, as the reality of the suitcase finally registered. You cannot leave me right now. I need you to help me fix this. I have packed my bags, and I am going to a hotel. Malik stated, his jaw tight. My attorney will serve you with the divorce papers by Monday morning. Do not call my phone. Do not come to my office. Caroline let out a devastated wail, burying her face in her hands. Malik completely ignored her. He stepped around his sobbing wife and walked directly up to the kitchen island where I was standing. He reached into the inner pocket of his wet jacket and pulled out a small silver USB drive. He placed it carefully on the marble counter, sliding it right next to my coffee mug. When the agents left our house to secure the perimeter, Malik said, looking me directly in the eyes, I started digging through Caroline's home office to find whatever she was hiding. She thought she was covering her tracks, but she is sloppy. I found this taped under her bottom desk drawer. I looked down at the silver drive, then back up at Malik. You will want to see what is on there, Paige, Malik said quietly, zipping his wet jacket. It is not just Patricia's identity she stole. She has been compiling financial data on you for the last 2 years. Malik did not wait for Caroline to respond. He simply turned on his heel and walked out the front door into the freezing rain, abandoning his wife on the floor of my kitchen. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing his exit. Caroline let out a ragged, devastated wail, scrambling to her feet and taking a chaotic step toward the hallway, but she froze when the front door immediately swung open again. Patricia stormed into the foyer. She was shivering, her cashmere coat damp from the rain. She had clearly been sitting in her car at the end of my driveway, too cowardly to face me, but too pathologically controlling to let Caroline handle her own crisis. She marched directly into the kitchen, taking in Caroline's ruined mascara and panicked, hyperventilating. Patricia immediately moved to shield her favorite daughter, throwing a venomous glare in my direction. I completely ignored my mother. My eyes were locked on the silver flash drive resting against my coffee mug. I walked into my home office, grabbed my laptop, and carried it back to the marble island. Caroline let out a sharp gasp. She lunged forward, her hands reaching out to grab the drive, but I slammed my palm down flat over the silver casing. The look of absolute naked terror on her face confirmed everything Malik had implied. I plugged the drive into the USB port and opened the main directory. Malik was an architect. His obsessive attention to structural detail had clearly translated into a flawless digital excavation of his wife's home office network. He had not just found a few stray files. He had copied her entire mirrored hard drive. I clicked the primary folder labeled with my name. Caroline had spent 2 solid years tracking my property purchases, mapping my anonymous limited liability companies, and trying to crack my encryption keys. She wanted to know exactly how much private wealth I had accumulated, so Brendan could figure out the most efficient way to steal it. She had treated my financial security like a puzzle to be solved for her own gain. But it was the second folder that caught my attention. It was labeled with Brendan's name, categorized under commercial bridge loans. I opened the master PDF file, the screen filled with a heavily structured commercial lending agreement from a predatory offshore banking institution. I scrolled past the terrifying interest rates and the principal loan amount of $5 million. Then I saw the collateral listing. It was not Brendan's non-existent corporate equity, it was a massive, high-yield retirement portfolio. I looked up at Patricia. She was busy smoothing Caroline's wet hair, glaring at me, as if I was the one who had brought federal agents to their doorstep. You did not just lose your identity to a background check, Patricia, I said. my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet kitchen. You actively co-signed his loans. Patricia froze. Her hand stopped moving through Caroline's hair. She blinked, her forehead wrinkling in genuine confusion. What on earth are you talking about? She snapped. This document, I replied, turning the laptop screen toward her. This is a $5 million commercial loan application filed 18 months ago. The primary applicant is my husband. The financial guarantor is you. You pledged your entire Vanguard retirement portfolio as collateral to secure a business expansion loan for Brendan. Patricia's face flushed a deep defensive red. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin with that familiar blind arrogance she used whenever her judgment was questioned. Brendan came to me with a brilliant commercial proposition, Patricia declared, her voice ringing with stubborn pride. He showed me his prospectus. He sat in my formal living room, explained the current market trends, and presented a clear, aggressive path to tripling my investment. He is a driven, ambitious man. A man who actually knows how to navigate the corporate landscape to build real wealth. He told me he just needed a little capital to bypass the bureaucratic red tape at his firm. I invested in his potential. You invested in his gender, I corrected her, feeling a dark, bitter humor rise in my chest. You spent your entire life dismissing my financial career because you thought accounting was unladylike. You practically forced me to endure those torturous family dinners where you praised every mediocre man in our social circle while entirely ignoring my corporate promotions. Brendan wore a tailored suit, smiled at you, used a few aggressive corporate buzzwords, and you willingly handed him the life savings you spent 40 years accumulating. Patricia crossed her arms tightly over her chest. It was a fully secure bridge loan she insisted, refusing to yield an inch. Brendan assured me the principal was heavily protected by his company's existing assets. He practically guaranteed a return. Brendan's company was a hollow shell, I stated, pulling up the next document on the drive. There were no assets. He used your retirement fund to pay off his mounting offshore gambling debts and to fund Nicole's luxury lifestyle. But he needed a clean internal route to process the guarantor paperwork without triggering my firm's security algorithms. He needed someone on the inside. That is exactly where Caroline came in. I looked down at my younger sister. She was trembling violently, staring at the floor. You processed the guarantor paperwork, I told Caroline, mapping out her exact betrayal. You logged into Patricia's Vanguard portal, verified the collateral assets, and routed the approval directly to Brendan's offshore lender. You sold out our mother's entire financial future for a $10,000 kickback, and you spent the next 2 years monitoring my personal accounts to make sure I never caught the discrepancy. Caroline pressed her hands over her ears, sobbing wildly. He said he would pay it back, she shrieked. Brendan promised me the loan would be cleared before the term ended. I just wanted my boutique. Patricia stood completely rigid in the center of the kitchen. The arrogant tilt of her chin finally wavered. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking suddenly ancient. The term, Patricia whispered, her voice incredibly fragile. The term was exactly 18 months. It was supposed to mature this week. It did mature this week, I confirmed, closing the laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. And Brendan skipped the country instead of paying the principal balance. When a primary borrower completely defaults on a commercial bridge loan, the predatory lender liquidates the guarantor's collateral automatically. The sharp, shrill chime of a text notification interrupted the heavy silence in the room. Patricia flinched violently. She reached into her expensive leather handbag with a hand that shook uncontrollably. She pulled out her smartphone. I watched her eyes slowly scan the glowing screen. It was an automated security alert from her premier banking institution. Patricia's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The screen remained perfectly illuminated, clearly displaying the automated notification, verifying the total unrestricted liquidation of her accounts. Her massive retirement balance had hit absolute zero. Her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and she collapsed heavily onto my pristine velvet sofa. Caroline dropped to her knees, frantically shaking Patricia's shoulders and shrieking for her mother to wake up. The sheer panic in Caroline's voice bounced off the high ceilings of the kitchen, but I did not move a single muscle to help. I stood behind the marble island, watching the two women who had spent my entire life dismissing my existence finally drown in the reality of their own choices. Malik watched the pathetic display for exactly 5 seconds. Then he looked up and met my gaze. He tilted his head toward the hallway. We left Caroline wailing on the floor over Patricia's unconscious body. I led Malik into my private home office and firmly shut the heavy oak door, instantly cutting off the hysterical sobbing echoing from the kitchen. The sudden quiet of the room was absolute, broken only by the steady drum of freezing rain against the window panes. Malik walked over to the leather armchair in the corner and sank heavily into it. He let out a long, slow breath, running a hand over his face. He looked at the walls of my office, taking in the multiple monitors, the complex financial mapping software running on the screens, and the meticulous organization of my physical files. "You really had them all fooled," Malik said, a genuine note of profound respect in his deep voice. "They thought you were just a glorified bookkeeper. They never had the slightest idea you were the one holding the scalpel." I took the seat behind my mahogany desk, crossing my arms. "You had them fooled too, Malik. You knew exactly what Caroline was doing, and you let her dig her own grave." "I am a senior risk assessment architect," Malik stated, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute clarity. "My entire career is based on analyzing structural integrity and financial liability for half-billion-dollar commercial developments. I evaluate the breaking point of massive investments before a single brick is laid." "You think I could not spot a fraudulent balance sheet sitting on my own dining room table?" I asked him why he never said anything. If he knew Brendan was faking collateral and Caroline was laundering the kickbacks, he could have blown the whistle years ago. Malik let out a dry, humorless laugh. He leaned back in the leather chair, his posture relaxing for the first time since he walked into my house. "If I had spoken up, your mother would have immediately turned it around to destroy my career," Malik explained quietly. "You know exactly how Patricia views me. I was never a successful architect to her. I was a diversity hire. I was the charity case who somehow manipulated her fragile, anxious daughter into marriage. Do you remember Thanksgiving 3 years ago?" I remembered it perfectly. Patricia sat at the head of the table. Malik continued, his voice hardening with the memory of the insult. "She looked right at me in front of 20 guests and asked if my firm was still letting me fetch coffee for the real partners. She told everyone how lucky I was that Caroline looked past my background and gave me a respectable life. She smiled that sickly sweet smile and patted my hand, treating a man with 2 advanced degrees like a stray dog she allowed on the furniture." Malik stared out the rain-slicked window, his jaw tight. "Because she thought I was an idiot, she spoke freely around me," Malik said. "Brendan spoke freely around me. They thought my silence was submission, but it was strategy." The moment I saw Brendan's initial prospectus for those commercial bridge loans, I recognized the structural fraud. The math was entirely fabricated. I knew Brendan was pulling a massive scam, and I knew Patricia was arrogant enough to fund it. I watched him carefully. "You isolated your liability." "Exactly." Malik nodded. 3 years ago, I quietly filed the legal paperwork to sever my personal assets, my business equity, and my architectural license from Caroline's financial footprint. I built an impenetrable legal wall around myself. Every dollar she funneled for Brendan was traced strictly to accounts bearing her sole signature. I played the quiet, grateful husband, keeping my head down while I gathered every piece of evidence necessary to ensure that when the federal agents finally knocked on my door, I would walk away completely untouched. I protected myself, Paige, just like you did. A heavy mutual understanding settled in the room. We were the only two people in this family who actually understood how the real world operated. We were the only two who had planned for the inevitable collapse. "But you did not just come here to drop off Caroline's hard drive and watch Patricia faint," I noted, observing the lingering tension in his shoulders. "You already cleared your name with the FBI this morning. You are legally safe. So why did you come to my house?" Malik sat forward. The exhausted relief vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, sharp urgency. He reached across the desk and tapped his index finger against the silver casing of my closed laptop. "Because your forensic algorithms missed something," Paige, Malik said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You caught the Vanguard liquidation. You caught the real estate fraud. You perfectly dismantled Brendan's domestic corporate structure, but you only looked at the loans he secured through standard offshore banking institutions. I narrowed my eyes, instantly running through the thousands of financial transactions I had audited over the last 6 months. Brendan did not just borrow from greedy offshore banks, Malik explained, the gravity of his words chilling the air in the room. His primary bridge loan was bundled with secondary shadow debt. He was desperate to cover his mounting gambling losses before Patricia's money cleared. So he tapped into an unregulated shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, a company named Aguila Investments. I knew the name immediately. It was a notoriously aggressive proxy firm. I used my commercial risk contacts to trace Aguila Investments last night. Malik continued, never breaking eye contact. Aguila is not a bank page, it is a front. It is a highly sophisticated money laundering syndicate directly linked to a massive cartel operation in Sinaloa. My breath hitched. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying velocity. Brendan did not run away to Mexico to take Nicole on a luxury vacation, Malik stated, confirming my sudden realization. He fled because the syndicate discovered his collateral was completely fabricated. He stole $5 million from a cartel, and he has absolutely no way to pay them back. Malik stood up from the armchair. He looked down at me, delivering the final devastating blow. The federal government freezing your sister's accounts is the least of her problems right now, Malik said. The people Brendan stole from do not send auditors. They do not file civil lawsuits. They are actively hunting for their missing money page. And they just landed in the city. The scent of roasted sage and melted butter filled the dining room, a sickeningly warm contrast to the absolute terror suffocating the people sitting around the table. It was Thanksgiving afternoon. The silver cutlery gleamed under the crystal chandelier, and the fine porcelain plates were arranged with militant precision. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, perfectly composed, watching my family attempt to maintain the illusion of control. Across from me sat Brendan. He looked nothing like the slick, arrogant corporate shark who had sneered at my retirement portfolios just a few weeks prior. His skin had a grayish, unhealthy pallor, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the paralyzing reality of a man out on temporary federal bail. Underneath the hem of his tailored trousers, the bulky black plastic of a federal ankle monitor bulged against his sock. Despite his physical deterioration, he still wore his expensive designer suit, clinging desperately to a fabricated superiority. Next to him sat Caroline. She was a twitchy, vibrating mess of raw panic. She had not bothered to style her hair, and her eyes constantly darted toward the front windows. Malik had made good on his promise. He was gone, and Caroline was entirely alone with the crushing weight of a federal IRS audit and the looming shadow of a cartel debt she had helped facilitate. Patricia presided at the head of the table. She carried the massive, perfectly roasted turkey out from the kitchen on a silver platter, setting it down with a heavy thud. She picked up the carving knife and the serving fork, her jaw set in a rigid line of absolute determination. She sliced the thickest, most succulent piece of white breast meat first. She carefully transferred it to Brendan's plate, adding a generous spoonful of homemade cranberry sauce. "Eat up, Brendan." Patricia murmured, her tone dripping with a maternal sympathy she had never once directed toward me. "You have been under an impossible amount of stress. You need your strength." She then turned the platter, rotating it until she found the charred, dried-out end piece near the wing. She hacked it off and dropped it onto my plate without a second glance. It landed with a dry, hollow sound. It was a petty, unspoken tradition in our household. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Sunday dinner, the Golden Children and their chosen partners always received the premium cuts, the best seats, the first pours of expensive wine. I consistently received the burnt scraps and the leftover dregs. It was Patricia's lifelong, calculated method of reminding me of my exact place in the family hierarchy. I was the placeholder. I was the background character. I picked up my knife and fork. I did not complain. I sliced a small piece of the dry, charred meat and chewed it slowly, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with my mother as she took her seat. We invited you here today, Paige, because we are a family. Patricia began folding her manicured hands tightly on the lace tablecloth. Her voice carried an artificial, magnanimous diplomacy. And families forgive each other. We are willing to look past your recent hostile actions and the terrible stress you have caused this family if you are willing to do what is necessary to protect us. Caroline leaned forward, her hands shaking so badly she knocked over her crystal water glass. The water pooled across the lace, but she did not even notice. You have to use Obsidian Holdings to pay off Aguila Investments right now, Paige. Caroline pleaded, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. The cartel contacts have been calling Brendan's burner phone every hour. They know where we live. Malik left me the IRS, froze everything, and these people are going to kill us. You have the capital. You have the power to make the federal agents go away and pay off the debt. You have to fix this. Brendan adjusted his tie, trying to muster his old bullying swagger. Your little corporate takeover was a neat trick, Paige, he sneered, though the tremor in his hands ruined the effect. But you overplayed your hand. You put Patricia's retirement in jeopardy. You put your own sister in the crosshairs of a federal money laundering audit. So here is what is going to happen. He pointed a finger at me across the table. You are going to log into your proxy firm, transfer the $5 million to the cartel's offshore accounts to clear my debt, and then you are going to draft a sworn affidavit for the FBI, Brendan demanded. You are going to claim you acted entirely alone in mismanaging the brokerage funds and falsifying the mortgage documents to build your wealth management firm. You take the fall for the federal white-collar charges and we walk away clean. You think you are untouchable because you have money now, but you do not know how the real world works. Cartels do not care about your spreadsheets. Patricia nodded in firm agreement, completely validating his delusional demands. It is the only logical solution, she stated, looking at me with cold authority. We are offering you a chance to redeem yourself, Paige. A chance to finally do something right for the people who raised you. You built that wealth in secret while married to Brendan, which means he is legally entitled to half of it anyway. You owe this family. You will fix this mess, or you will spend the rest of your miserable life knowing you destroyed your mother, your sister, and your husband. I sat in perfect silence. I listened to their ridiculous, arrogant demands. They truly, genuinely believed I was still the obedient, desperate girl who would eat their burnt scraps and solve their self-inflicted disasters just to earn a fraction of their approval. They thought they could trap me in this dining room and bully me into sacrificing my freedom and my empire to shield them from a cartel and the federal government. I took another slow, deliberate bite of the charred turkey. I chewed it, swallowed, and set my silver fork down on the porcelain plate with a sharp click. I reached for my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room became physically unbearable. Caroline was holding her breath. Brendan was sweating. Patricia was glaring. I raised my left wrist and looked calmly at the diamond face of my watch. You all have exactly 5 minutes to finish your meal before the real guests arrive, I said. Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes as she reached for her crystal wineglass. Stop being theatrical, Paige. No one is coming. You have no allies left. Your little warnings are pathetic. Brendan let out a harsh, barking laugh. He reached inside his tailored designer jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it across the mahogany table. It slid past the gravy boat and the bowls of perfectly roasted vegetables, stopping right next to my plate with the charred piece of turkey. Open it, Brendan ordered, leaning back in his chair with an air of absolute authority. I picked up the envelope and pulled out a stack of dense, legal-sized papers. It was a sworn affidavit. I scanned the first page, my eyes quickly absorbing the heavily manipulated legal jargon. It was a complete confession. The document explicitly stated that I had secretly manipulated Caroline's banking credentials to access Patricia's retirement funds. It claimed I had independently orchestrated the offshore wire transfers to Aguila Investments to artificially inflate the liquidity of my own wealth management firm. The final paragraph completely absolved Brendan, painting him as a naive husband who had just discovered his wife's massive financial crimes. You want me to sign a federal confession for wire fraud and cartel money laundering? I said, my voice remaining perfectly even. I want you to fix the mess you made, Patricia corrected sharply, tapping her fork against her plate. You have millions hidden away. You have lawyers on retainer. Brendan is facing decades in a federal penitentiary and Caroline's accounts are frozen. You have the resources to survive a federal indictment. They do not. And if I refuse to commit perjury to save a thief and an accomplice? I asked, looking directly at my mother. Caroline slammed her hands on the table, making the silverware rattle. Then I will personally hand over my mirrored hard drives to the SEC and the FBI, she threatened, her voice shrill with panic. I spent 2 years creating a digital footprint that points every single discrepancy back to your IP address. If you do not sign that paper, Mom and I will testify that you forced us to facilitate those loans. Your corporate licenses will be revoked by Monday morning. Your clients will flee. You will be penniless, disgraced, and in a federal holding cell. Brendan smiled, picking up his wine glass. He swirled the expensive red liquid, thoroughly enjoying the illusion of power. He thought he had me cornered. He thought Caroline's fabricated digital trail and Patricia's vicious loyalty had finally broken me. It is actually brilliant, Paige. Brendan sneered, his confidence swelling. You spent your entire life trying to prove you did not need anyone. You built this massive, intimidating empire completely on your own, shutting everyone else out. But that cold independence is exactly what makes you the perfect scapegoat. No judge, no jury, and no federal agent will doubt for a single second that the ruthless, calculating Paige acted entirely alone to build her fortune. He set his glass down and leaned across the table, his face twisting into a mask of deep, festering resentment. The polished corporate facade finally dropped, revealing the fragile, deeply insecure man underneath. I always hated that about you, Brendan, spat his voice, dropping into a venomous whisper. You never needed me. You never asked for my help. You never valued my opinion, and you never once looked at me the way a wife should look at her husband. You treated me like a decorative accessory while you built your empire. You emasculated me every single day just by existing. He pointed a finger at my chest. Nicole is a real woman. When I bought her a diamond, she cried. When I told her I was securing millions for our future, she looked at me like I was a god. She actually needed me. She made me feel like a real man while you just made me feel like a subordinate waiting for a performance review. You brought this entirely on yourself by being so completely unlovable. I sat in perfect silence. I listened to his pathetic, fragile speech. I looked at Patricia, who was nodding in silent agreement with a man who had stolen her entire life savings simply because he was currently putting me in my place. I looked at Caroline, who was biting her lip, waiting eagerly for her salvation. They truly believed I was going to sacrifice my freedom to protect them. I glanced at my watch. 2 minutes left. You want my signature? I said softly. Sign the paper, Patricia commanded, gesturing to the document. Save this family. Do the right thing for once in your life. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer. I pulled out my favorite fountain pen, a solid gold Mont Blanc. I uncapped it slowly, letting the sharp metallic click echo loudly in the quiet dining room. I placed the affidavit flat on the table, smoothing out the edges of the paper. Brendan let out a loud, shuddering breath of relief. He actually thought he had won. He thought his childish insults and their combined extortion had successfully bullied me into submission. I pressed the gold nib to the signature line. I signed my name with a heavy, fluid flourish, dragging the dark ink across the page. I capped the pen, slipped it back into my pocket, and slid the document back across the mahogany table. Brendan snatched it up instantly. A victorious, arrogant grin stretched across his face as he looked down at the signature line to verify his absolute salvation. But his eyes did not stop at my name. They locked onto the small, precise line of text I had added directly beneath my signature. The triumphant grin vanished. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His eyes widened in absolute horror, staring at the fresh ink on the page. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He stopped breathing. He stared at the words written in black ink. Paige Sterling, Primary Cooperating Witness, Federal Bureau of Investigation, signed in the presence of active surveillance audio. Brendan's hands began to shake so violently that the thick stack of legal papers slipped from his numb fingers. The document hit the mahogany table, knocking against his crystal wine glass and sending a streak of dark red bleeding into the pristine white lace tablecloth. He stared at the spreading stain, his jaw working uselessly, completely unable to process the magnitude of his own destruction. Patricia snapped out of her rigid posture, her voice sharp with sudden creeping anxiety. "Brendan, what is it? What did she write?" Caroline leaned over and snatched the document from the table. Her eyes darted across the bottom of the page, reading the customized signature line. She let out a choked, guttural sound, dropping the paper as if the ink had physically burned her fingers. She scrambled backward in her chair, pressing a hand over her mouth. I calmly reached across the table, retrieved the affidavit, and neatly folded it in half. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer, keeping my movements deliberate and unhurried. "That was not a confession, Brendan," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. "That was an absolute waiver of liability. By presenting me with a fabricated legal document demanding I perjure myself and explicitly threatening to sabotage my career to cover up your financial crimes, you just handed the Department of Justice a textbook case for witness tampering and federal extortion." I tapped the face of my watch. "And you did it all on an open, active surveillance channel. Every threat you just made, every admission of guilt regarding the cartel kickbacks, every detail of your offshore money laundering. The FBI agents parked in the surveillance van at the end of the street heard every single word." Patricia stood up so fast her heavy oak chair tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. "You are lying," she hissed, though her face was entirely drained of blood. "You do not have the clearance to broker a deal like that with the federal government. You are just a glorified bookkeeper. You do not have the authority or the intelligence to orchestrate this." "I have the authority because I am the one who built the cage you are currently sitting in, Patricia," I replied, refusing to break her gaze. "You spent 4 years mocking my education. You told your country club friends that my degree in forensic data analysis from a second-rate state school was useless. You said I lacked the ambition to be anything more than a corporate drone pushing numbers on a spreadsheet for real executives." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table, invading their space. "Those numbers are exactly how I dismantled your entire life. I used those useless forensic skills to map every single fraudulent bridge loan Brendan secured. I traced the shell companies through a labyrinth of proxy servers straight back to Aguila Investments in the Cayman Islands. I wrote the custom algorithms that matched Caroline's specific IP address to the mirrored hard drives she used to launder the kickbacks while you were supposedly out on your mother-daughter spa days. I did not just stumble onto your mess, I excavated it." Caroline buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the fine linen napkins. Her manicured nails dug into her scalp as the reality of a federal prison sentence finally eclipsed her boutique dreams. I cross-referenced the dates of Brendan's supposed business trips with his offshore wire transfers to Nicole's luxury accounts. I continued mapping out their ruin step by step. I packaged the entire conspiracy fully documented, chronologically ordered, and flawlessly indexed. Then I handed it directly to the federal prosecutor in exchange for absolute ironclad immunity. I turned my attention back to my ex-husband. He was staring at me as if looking at a ghost. "You needed me to be the scapegoat because you are all completely financially illiterate," I stated. "You thought you could blindside me at a Thanksgiving dinner and bully me into submission because I have always eaten the burnt scraps you threw at me. But I stopped eating scraps the day I realized I owned the entire table. You are right about one thing, Brendan. I never needed you. And right now the federal government does not need you either. They already have everything." Brendan's chest heaved. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. His entire fabricated reality, his fragile ego, his perceived superiority, his desperate need to feel like a real man who held power over women shattered into millions of jagged pieces. He was not a corporate shark. He was a cornered thief who had stolen $5 million from a ruthless cartel, and his only shield had just evaporated. The cartel knows you are sitting in this dining room right now, I added, lowering my voice to a lethal whisper. They know you are out on temporary bail, and they know you do not have their money. You bitch! Brendan growled, a feral, unhinged sound vibrating from the back of his throat. His fragile masculinity finally snapped. Brendan planted his hands on the table and lunged directly across the Thanksgiving spread. He kicked off the mahogany edge, sending the heavy silver platter of roasted turkey crashing to the floor. Gravy boats shattered and crystal glasses exploded, sending shards of glass and red wine flying across the room. His hands reached out, aiming directly for my throat, his eyes wide with violent desperation. I did not even flinch. Before Brendan could make it halfway across the table, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent parlor archway. Malik had never left the property. He had been standing by the front door waiting for my signal. Malik moved with terrifying, calculated speed. He intercepted Brendan mid-lunge, gripping my ex-husband by the lapels of his designer jacket. With a single fluid motion of expert precision, Malik ripped Brendan off the table and slammed him violently onto the hardwood floor. Brendan let out a breathless grunt as all the air was forced from his lungs. Malik dropped his weight, driving his knee sharply into the center of Brendan's back, pinning him completely flat against the ruined turkey and broken crystal. He grabbed Brendan's right arm and wrenched it up between his shoulder blades until a sharp, pathetic cry of pain echoed through the dining room. Brendan let out a wet, strangled gasp as Malik drove his knee deeper between his shoulder blades. The sound of shattered crystal crunching under Malik's heavy boots punctuated the absolute silence that had fallen over the rest of the room. Caroline stood frozen against the dining room wall, her hands clamped over her mouth, completely incapable of processing the sight of her docile, subservient husband physically dominating the man she had been secretly conspiring with for years. Patricia finally found her voice. She shrieked a high and piercing sound demanding that Malik unhand Brendan immediately. She took a step forward, her hands raised as if she intended to pull Malik off by force. "Do not take another step," Patricia Malik warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that stopped her dead in her tracks. "If you interfere, I will consider you an accessory to his assault, and I will happily let the authorities press charges against you for that as well." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. I walked around the debris of the ruined turkey and the spilled cranberry sauce, stopping just inches from where Brendan's face was pressed into the hardwood floor. He glared up at me, his breathing ragged, a line of blood trickling from a small cut on his cheek where a wine glass had shattered. "You thought you could intimidate me into taking the fall for your cartel debt?" I said, looking down at him with absolute disgust. "But you failed to realize that while you were busy trying to construct a fake digital footprint to frame me, I was working directly with the Department of Justice." As of 9 o'clock this morning, the United States Treasury, acting on the forensic evidence I provided, executed a comprehensive immediate asset freeze on every single entity connected to your bridge loans. Caroline let out a sharp cry. She rushed forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table. "What do you mean a freeze?" she demanded, her voice shaking violently. "You cannot just freeze everything. I have payroll on Monday. I have vendors. You have nothing." "Caroline," I corrected her, turning my gaze to my sister, "every cent in your boutique's corporate accounts was flagged as laundered cartel money. Your personal checking, your offshore proxy accounts, your secret safety deposit boxes in Delaware. All of it has been seized by the Internal Revenue Service. You do not own a boutique anymore. You own a federal crime scene." Caroline's knees buckled. She collapsed into her chair, her manicured hands gripping her hair as she began to hyperventilate. Patricia stared at me, her face pale and slack. She gripped the back of her chair to steady herself. "But my house," she stammered, looking around the lavishly decorated dining room. "My name is on the deed to this house. Brendan said the loans were secured by his corporate assets. My home is protected." I shook my head, feeling a cold wave of satisfaction wash over me. "Brendan did not have corporate assets, Patricia. He used the equity in this house as secondary collateral to appease Agala Investments when he missed his first payment." He forged your signature on the lien, and Caroline notarized it using her expired state seal. The moment the FBI verified the fraud, the bank seized the deed. This house does not belong to you anymore. It belongs to the federal government. Patricia let out a guttural, devastated wail. She slumped over the back of the chair, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered terror. "I am 68 years old. I will be homeless. You are throwing your own mother out onto the street. You are a monster, Paige." I walked directly over to Patricia. I leaned in close, ensuring she could not look away from my eyes. "Do you remember the winter I turned 18? I asked, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You demanded I hand over the $8,000 I had saved from working double shifts at the diner. You wanted to use my college savings to fund Caroline's luxury networking trip to Europe because you felt she deserved to see the world. When I refused to give you my money, you packed my clothes into garbage bags. You opened the front door into a blizzard, shoved me out into 2 feet of snow, and locked the deadbolt." Patricia swallowed hard, her eyes darting away in sudden cowardly guilt. "You stood on the other side of the glass while I froze," I continued, refusing to let her look away. "You told me that shelter was a privilege reserved for family members who actually contributed to the household. You told me I was useless, and you left me to walk 3 miles in a snowstorm to a bus station. I survived that night, Patricia. I survived everything you and Caroline ever did to me. Now you get to learn exactly how cold the real world is when you have burned every bridge you ever had." On the floor, Brendan let out a pathetic, desperate groan. He tried to squirm under Malik's weight. "Paige, please," he begged, all his previous arrogance completely eviscerated. "The cartel knows where I am. If the feds take the money, Aguila will kill me. They will kill all of us. You have to tell the Department of Justice to back off. You have to make a deal." "I am done making deals with parasites," I told him coldly. Before Brendan could beg again, a harsh, sweeping flash of brilliant red and blue light cut through the heavy darkness outside. The intense, strobing colors pierced through the sheer curtains of the dining room windows, painting the walls and the ceiling in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. The sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt on the wet pavement echoed from the driveway, followed instantly by the loud, slamming thud of tactical vehicle doors. Caroline let out a terrified scream. Patricia covered her ears, shrinking back against the wall. Brendan went completely limp under Malik, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing dread, as heavy, authoritative footsteps pounded up the front porch stairs. The heavy oak front door did not just open, it was forcefully breached. The deafening crash of the battering ram splintering the doorframe sent a violent shockwave through the dining room. Cold November air rushed into the house, carrying with it the sharp static crackle of police radios and the blinding glare of red and blue emergency lights. A dozen federal marshals flooded the grand hallway, their tactical boots stomping over Patricia's imported Persian rugs. They moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency, their weapons drawn, and their voices booming with absolute authority, demanding everyone freeze and keep their hands visible. Malik did not flinch. He maintained his crushing grip on Brendan's arm, keeping his knee firmly planted in the center of Brendan's back until the lead marshal approached the ruined dining table. Malik gave a curt, professional nod, stepping back to allow 2 heavily armed agents to take his place. They hauled Brendan off the floor without a shred of gentleness. Brendan's expensive designer suit was completely destroyed, smeared with congealed gravy, mashed potatoes, and shards of broken crystal. The lead marshal slammed Brendan face first into the mahogany wall paneling, forcefully wrenching his arms behind his back. The cold, sharp click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over Caroline's hysterical sobbing. "Brendan Cole, you are under arrest for fleeing federal jurisdiction, violating the terms of your bail, multiple counts of wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." The marshal announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." Brendan thrashed against the wood paneling, his face red and contorted with panic. He twisted his neck, searching desperately for Patricia, who was curled into a pathetic ball in her chair, shaking uncontrollably. "Patricia, do something!" Brendan screamed, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Call your lawyers! Tell them Paige set me up! Tell them she is the one who moved the money!" Patricia did not even look at him. She was staring blankly at the Marshalls, her mind entirely shattered by the realization that she was sitting in a house she no longer owned, facing total destitution. She had spent her entire life curating an image of untouchable wealth and prestige, and it had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. I remained standing at the end of the table, perfectly composed, watching the illusion of their superiority crumble into dust. A sudden commotion outside drew my attention. The sound of high heels scraping frantically against the concrete steps was followed by a shrill, piercing shriek. Two marshals hauled a violently struggling woman through the shattered front doorway. It was Nicole. She was wearing a tailored cashmere coat and holding a quilted designer travel bag. She had been sitting in Brendan's leased getaway car at the end of the street, waiting to flee the state the moment he extorted the funds from me. Now her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess, and her wrists were bound tightly in zip ties. The moment Nicole was dragged into the dining room and saw me standing there, her entire demeanor shifted. The feral fighting panic vanished instantly, replaced by a grotesque fabricated mask of sisterly desperation. She reverted immediately to the fake best friend persona she had utilized for years. "Paigey," she wailed, her voice trembling with forced theatrical tears. "Paigey, please help me. You have to tell them we are best friends." I had no idea what Brendan was doing. He told me we were just going on a vacation. I did not know about any cartel money. "You know me, Paige. I would never hurt you. We are sisters. Tell them to let me go." I walked slowly around the edge of the ruined dining table, my shoes crunching over the broken plates, until I stood directly in front of her. Nicole looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, completely detached from the reality of her own actions. She genuinely believed her manipulative charm could erase years of calculated betrayal. "You are wearing the exact same perfume you wore the day you helped me pick out my wedding dress," I said, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying clearly across the silent room. "You stood in that bridal boutique, held my hand, and cried tears of joy while telling me how lucky I was to marry a man like Brendan. And then you went back to his hotel room and slept with him that exact same night." Nicole's fake tears stopped instantly. Her mouth fell open in shock. "You are not a victim, Nicole," I stated, staring into her terrified eyes. "You are a parasite who thought she found a golden ticket. But Brendan is bankrupt, his assets are frozen, and you are going to spend the next 10 years in a federal prison for aiding and abetting a fugitive. Take her out of my house." The Marshalls did not hesitate. They dragged Nicole backward out the door as she began to scream obscenities, dropping the innocent act entirely and revealing the vile, opportunistic reality beneath her cashmere coat. Caroline watched Nicole being dragged into the flashing lights of the police cruisers. Her entire body shook as the lead marshal turned his attention toward the dining table. Caroline knew her name was on the fraudulent notary stamps. She knew her boutique accounts had been used as the primary laundering funnel. Desperation seized her completely. She scrambled out of her chair and threw herself toward Malik. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. She still believed he was her submissive, obedient husband, the man who handled her problems and took her verbal abuse without a single complaint. "Malik, you have to tell them." Caroline pleaded, her voice a hysterical, breathless rasp. "Tell the Marshalls I was just following Brendan's orders. Tell them I did not know where the money was coming from. You know how confused I get with paperwork. You know I am innocent. Please, Malik, protect me." Malik looked down at the hands gripping his sleeve. There was no warmth in his eyes, no submission, and no sympathy. He reached up and slowly, deliberately peeled Caroline's fingers off his jacket. He stepped away from her, leaving her standing alone in the center of the wreckage. Malik reached inside the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, meticulously labeled file folder. He did not look at Caroline as he extended his arm, handing the file directly to the lead federal marshal. "She is not innocent," Malik said, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. "She is the one who authorized the identity theft." The lead federal marshal did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He took the meticulously labeled file from Malik, flipped open the heavy manila cover, and scanned the top page. His eyes hardened as he processed the digital logs, the routing numbers, and the irrefutable proof of Caroline's active participation in the fraud ring. He snapped the folder shut and gave a sharp, commanding nod to the two agents standing by the doorway. They moved in instantly. They grabbed Caroline by the arms, hauling her up from her chair. Caroline shrieked a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She kicked her expensive heels against the hardwood floor, twisting wildly to escape their rigid grip. She screamed for our mother, begging Patricia to do something to stop them, to fix the disaster, just as she had fixed every other mistake Caroline had ever made. Patricia lunged forward, her hands outstretched in a desperate, futile attempt to reach her golden child. A third marshal simply stepped into her path, raising a massive, heavily armored arm that forced Patricia back into the dining table. The agents dragged Caroline out through the splintered front doorway. Her wails echoed down the cold driveway, cutting through the freezing November air until they were abruptly silenced by the heavy slam of a police cruiser door. Malik stood in the center of the room, completely unbothered by the chaos. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, turned to me, and gave a single silent nod of absolute respect. Without a word to the woman who had tormented him for years, he walked out into the night, leaving his ruined marriage and the shattered family entirely behind. The flashing red and blue lights slowly pulled away from the property, the wailing sirens fading into the distance. The heavy front door hung crookedly off its shattered hinges, allowing the biting winter wind to sweep through the grand hallway and cut into the dining room. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavy, absolute, and utterly final. Patricia stood trembling in the center of the wreckage. Her perfect Thanksgiving fantasy was now a graveyard of broken crystal, overturned chairs, and spilled wine soaking into the expensive lace tablecloth. The golden children she had worshipped her entire life were gone, locked in the back of federal transport vehicles, facing decades behind bars. Her shoulders collapsed. The rigid, imperious matriarch who had dictated my every movement, who had commanded absolute obedience through fear and financial manipulation, simply ceased to exist. She crumbled into a frail, terrified old woman right in front of my eyes. She looked around the room, the terrifying reality of her isolation finally penetrating her thick wall of denial. The bank held the deed to her home. The Internal Revenue Service had frozen every single account bearing her name. Her social standing was obliterated. She had absolutely nothing left. Patricia slowly turned to face me. Her meticulously applied makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She fell to her knees among the shattered porcelain and crushed roasted vegetables. "Paige, please!" she sobbed, her voice a ragged, desperate rasp. She reached out, her shaking hands grasping at the fabric of my trousers. "You have to help me. I am your mother. You cannot leave me like this. You have the money. You have the lawyers and the federal contacts. You can fix this. You can explain that I did not know anything. Please, Paige, I am begging you. Do not let them take my home." I looked down at her hands clutching my clothes. I did not move to comfort her. I did not offer a single word of reassurance. I looked past her kneeling form, directing my gaze to the ruined dining table. Right at my assigned seat at the far isolated end of the table, sitting on a chipped porcelain plate, was the dry, charred piece of turkey she had hacked off near the wing and tossed to me just an hour ago. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her hands to drop away from my legs. "Look at that plate, Patricia," I commanded, my voice brutally calm, echoing sharply in the quiet room. She blinked, her tear-filled eyes darting to the burnt meat. "You fed them the premium cuts their entire lives," I said, pointing at the wreckage. "You gave Brendan the best seat at the table. You gave Caroline the finest portions. You covered their debts, you hid their profound mistakes, and you actively fed their delusions of superiority. You taught Caroline she never had to work a day in her life because her charm and your bank account would always carry her. You taught Brendan that he could take whatever he wanted from whoever he wanted because the rules simply did not apply to him." Patricia let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, but I refused to stop. "You enabled their bottomless greed every single day while you punished my independence." I continued, my words striking her like physical blows. You demanded I sacrifice my own future to fund their vanity. You built this exact moment, Patricia. Your blind, vicious favoritism created the arrogant criminals who just stole your entire life. You handed them the knife, and you watched them stab you in the back. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, wet sobs. She had no defense. She had no lies left to spin. She was completely cornered by the truth of her own making. I turned away from her kneeling figure and walked to the hallway closet. I pulled my tailored cashmere coat from the wooden hanger and slipped it over my shoulders, adjusting the collar against the incoming winter chill. I picked up my leather handbag from the console table. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her breathing erratic and panicked. She realized with absolute certainty that I was not going to write a check to save her. I was not going to make a call to my federal contacts. I was walking out the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice high and breathless, with pure unfiltered terror. She looked at the splintered front door swinging in the wind, then back at me, her eyes wide with panic. "The bank took the house. My cards are frozen. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" I paused at the threshold. I looked back at the woman who had spent 30 years trying to break my spirit. I felt absolutely no anger, no pity, and no regret. I felt nothing but a profound, liberating peace. Good luck. 6 months later, the bitter November wind that had swept through Patricia's shattered front door was a distant memory. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, watching the late spring sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the Chicago skyline. The city stretched out below me, an expansive grid of steel and glass, humming with relentless energy. My consultancy firm occupied the top 2 floors of the high-rise. We specialized in forensic financial auditing and corporate risk mitigation, a highly lucrative market, especially when your founding reputation was built on dismantling an international laundering ring. The heavy oak door to my office clicked open. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. The steady, measured footsteps stepping onto the plush carpet belonged to a man who had reclaimed his own life with the same calculated precision I had used to secure mine. Malik walked into the room holding a sleek leather folio. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit projecting an aura of absolute authority that Carolyn had spent years trying to suppress. He was no longer the subservient, beaten-down husband fetching coffee and absorbing verbal abuse. He was now the head of risk management for my firm, and he was arguably the sharpest executive on my payroll. "Good afternoon, Paige," Malik said, taking a seat at the polished glass conference table in the center of the office. "The quarterly compliance audit is finalized. We secured the 3 new corporate contracts, and our internal risk assessments are flawless." I turned away from the window and took my seat across from him. "Excellent work, Malik. The expansion into the East Coast market is tracking exactly to our projections." We discussed the margins for a few minutes, diving into the operational logistics. The professional synergy we shared was effortless. Once the official business concluded, Malik closed the folio. He leaned back in his chair, a faint, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The federal prosecutor's office sent over the final closure documents this morning," he stated, his tone shifting from corporate strategy to personal vindication. "The sentencing guidelines were executed exactly as the Department of Justice negotiated." I folded my hands on the table, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. Brendan's arrogance had finally met the crushing weight of the federal justice system. He was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary for wire fraud, extortion, and fleeing federal jurisdiction. The cartel debt he had desperately tried to pin on me had caught up with him, but the federal protective custody he begged for came at the cost of giving up every single associate he had ever worked with. He was entirely isolated, stripped of his designer suits, his luxury cars, and his delusions of grandeur. Nicole was right there in the system with him. Her attempt to play the innocent, confused victim dissolved the moment federal investigators pulled the encrypted communications from her phone. She was serving 8 years for aiding and abetting a known fugitive and conspiracy to commit fraud. Her cashmere coats and curated social media presence were permanently traded for a standard-issue prison uniform. And Caroline, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, Malik did not flinch at the mention of his ex-wife. She received 10 years. The judge did not look favorably upon her using a fraudulent notary seal to authorize the theft of your identity, nor her use of a boutique as a laundering front. Her assets have been completely liquidated to pay federal restitution. We sat in the quiet luxury of the office, letting the reality of their destruction settle around us. There was no guilt. There was only the sterile, pristine environment of accountability. There is one more update, Malik added, adjusting his cuffs. It concerns Patricia. I looked at him, waiting. I had not spoken a single word to my mother since I walked out of her ruined dining room 6 months ago. The IRS seized the remainder of her hidden proxy accounts last week. Malik explained, his voice devoid of pity. She was officially evicted from the temporary housing the state provided. According to the asset forfeiture report, she is currently renting a single-room apartment in a rundown complex on the industrial side of the city. She took a job working the cash register at a local diner. Minimum wage. I absorbed the information, feeling a chilling sense of poetic justice. Patricia, a woman who had spent her entire life judging the working class, a woman who had thrown her 18-year-old daughter out into a blizzard because she deemed her a financial burden, was now spending her twilight years standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, serving cheap coffee to truck drivers, just to afford her electric bill. She was living the exact life she had once mocked me for surviving. She had enabled the monsters that eventually devoured her, and she was left with absolutely nothing. Malik stood up and walked over to the mahogany wet bar nestled against the far wall of the office. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling mineral water over ice, handing one to me before raising his own. To a flawless quarter, Malik said, his eyes reflecting the brilliant sunlight pouring into the room, and to dead weight permanently shed. To unshakable success, I replied, clinking my glass against his. The crystal chimed with a clear, sharp ring. I took a sip, the cold water grounding me in the absolute perfection of the present moment. Malik gave a respectful nod and exited the office to return to his division, leaving me alone with the skyline. I walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Down below, millions of people were rushing through their daily lives, fighting their own battles. I placed my hand against the cool glass. I had not just survived the betrayal of my family and my husband. I had not just escaped their trap. I had meticulously engineered the ultimate legal destruction of my abusers. I took their arrogance, weaponized their greed, and used the full force of the law to obliterate them. I looked out over the sprawling city, breathing in the sweet, clean air of total freedom. They were locked in cages of their own making, and I owned the world. The core lesson embedded in this revenge motif is that your self-worth should never be dictated by a toxic family dynamic. When faced with constant belittlement and favoritism, the protagonist doesn't waste her energy seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, she channels her pain into quiet, undeniable progress. By securing her own financial independence and building her secret weapon, she reclaims her power on her own terms. Ultimately, the most satisfying vindication isn't born from screaming matches, but from the unshakable confidence of self-made success. Share your own journey of overcoming family toxicity in the comments below.